He had never expected to inherit anything beyond a few old family photos and some dusty furniture. Life had been quiet, routine, and predictable until that day when a letter arrived. Formal and crisp, with his name neatly typed on the envelope. The handwriting of the signature was unfamiliar, but the words inside held weight. The letter explained that a relative he barely knew had passed away and unexpectedly left him a piece of land. Not just any land, but a sprawling property that included a private lake. He had always imagined a lake as something distant, it belonging to vacations and postcards, not something he could actually own. At first, disbelief clouded his mind. He read the letter several times, each time shaking his head in amazement. There had been no hints, no casual mentions in family gatherings, no subtle clues dropped during holiday dinners. It was as if the universe had quietly placed this gift in his lap, waiting for him to discover it. The idea of owning a lake was surreal. He pictured the calm water glistening under the sun, the gentle ripple of waves brushing against the shore, and the sense of peace that such a place could bring. He could almost feel the fresh air and hear the quiet hum of nature surrounding him. After the initial shock, excitement began to settle in. He imagined walking along the shore, fishing in the cool morning light, and sitting by the water in the evening watching the sun sink below the horizon. But beneath the excitement was also a layer of uncertainty. He had inherited the lake, yes, but what came with it? Responsibilities, legal obligations, maintenance. These thoughts were uneasy, nagging at the back of his mind as he made plans to visit the property. The drive to the property was long. He passed familiar roads, then unfamiliar stretches, fields, in clusters of trees that seemed to grow wilder the further he drove. When the lake finally came into view, it took his breath away. It was more beautiful than he had imagined. A serene body of water tucked away like a secret treasure. The surface reflected the sky in shades of blue and gold, and the surrounding trees added a splash of green that made the whole scene feel like it belonged to a painting. He parked the car at the edge of the property and simply stood there, taking it all in. It felt almost sacred. A piece of the world that had been quietly waiting for him. Walking around the perimeter of the lake, he noticed signs of life and activity he hadn't anticipated. Footpaths worn down by frequent use meandered close to the water. A small dock jutted into the lake, its wood weathered but sturdy. And then he saw its signs that other people had been using this lake. Fishing lines left tangled in the branches, footprints leading to the water, and faint evidence of camping near the shore. He paused, realizing that while he had inherited the lake, it wasn't exactly untouched. There were people who seemed to feel some sense of ownership, even if legally. It was his. He spent the day exploring, walking slowly to take in every corner of his new property. There was a small cabin at one end of the lake, more of a shed than a full house, but it looked like it had been used recently. He wondered who had been there, why they had been there, and what rights they thought they had. He found a few tools, old fishing gear, and some scattered supplies. Nothing valuable, but enough to suggest that the lake had not been forgotten or ignored. It was a strange mix of feeling that he had been given something, precious in knowing that he would have to assert his rights to protect it. That evening, he sat by the lake, letting the gentle sounds of water and rustling leaves calm his racing thoughts. He felt a connection to the land, a sense of responsibility that was both thrilling and daunting. The inheritance was not just land or water. It was a chance to claim something entirely his own, to carve a space where he could control his surroundings and protect a place that had been quietly cared for by others before him. But he knew that ownership came with challenges. He had no idea who had been using the lake or what conflicts might arise when they realized it now belonged to someone else. The next morning, he began to take practical steps. He wanted to understand exactly what he owned. He combed through the documents that had come with the inheritance, reading surveys and legal papers, noting boundaries, easements, and rights of way. The language was formal and sometimes confusing, but he took his time, making sure he understood the extent of his property. He wanted to be thorough because he sensed that misunderstandings could lead to disputes. He started imagining what steps he might need to take to protect the lake and its surrounding land. Fences, gates, signage, all practical measures to ensure that his ownership was recognized and respected. As he explored further, he began to notice subtle signs of the nearby Homeowners Association, an organized group that appeared to have some influence over the area. He saw markers, small flags, and even remnants of HOA communications scattered among the trees and along the edges of neighboring properties. There was a sense that while the land was his, the surrounding community had rules, expectations, and a certain mindset that he would need to navigate carefully. It was clear that the lake might not be as private as he had first imagined. Over the next few days, he met some of the neighbors, exchanging polite greetings and small talk. Their reactions were curious, some friendly, some wary. A few asked questions about the lake, seemingly casual at first, but with a tone that hinted at deeper interest. He realized that the inheritance was not just a personal gift. It was something that affected the entire neighborhood. People had been accustomed to accessing or using the lake, and now a new owner had appeared, someone who could change the status quo. He felt a mix of anticipation and unease, knowing that he would need to approach this situation carefully, balancing firmness with diplomacy. Despite the undercurrent of potential conflict, he continued to enjoy the simple pleasures of his new property. Early mornings were spent walking along the shore, breathing in the crisp air and listening to birds. Afternoons were for sitting quietly, observing the patterns of the water and the life that thrived around it. He began to feel a sense of belonging, a connection to the land that transcended legal documents or disputes. The lake had become more than an inheritance. It was a place where he could reflect, recharge, and appreciate the quiet rhythms of nature. Yet the peacefulness was tinged with awareness. Every step he took, every corner he explored, reminded him that others might not see the land in the same way he did. There were interests, assumptions, and perhaps even entitlement that he would need to confront. The lake, serene and inviting, had already been part of the lives of others, and change would not come easily. He realized that ownership was not just about holding a title. It was about asserting rights, understanding community dynamics, and being prepared for challenges he had not yet faced. As the sun set on his first week as the lake's owner, he felt a mixture of gratitude, excitement, and determination. He had inherited something extraordinary, a slice of nature that held beauty, tranquility, and potential. But with that inheritance came responsibility, vigilance, and the need to stand firm in the face of any obstacles. He understood that the journey ahead would test patience, courage, and clarity of thought. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment to simply sit by the water, to watch the light dance across the lake, and to feel a deep sense of possibility. The lake was his, and it was just the beginning of a story he was ready to write. It was a week after he had first set foot on the property, when the first conversation with the Homeowners Association began. He had been checking some old fences near the lake, making notes about areas that might need repairs, when a car slowly drove up the dirt path. Two men stepped out, formal and confident, with clipboards in hand. He hadn't expected visitors, so he stopped walking and waited as they approached. They introduced themselves as representatives of the HOA. Their voices were polite, but there was an unmistakable undertone of authority, as if they assumed they had some claim over his land. They congratulated him on his inheritance, which was courteous on the surface, but quickly moved into the main reason for their visit. They mentioned that the lake had been part of the neighborhood for years, a place where members of the community often fished, swam, and held small gatherings. Then, almost casually, they asked if he had considered selling the lake to the HOA for $500,000. He blinked.
Startled.
$500,000 sounded like a lot of money. But the way the offer was made, it felt less like a genuine proposal and more like a test. They spoke as though the sale was already expected, implying that he should feel lucky to be offered such a deal. He could sense the pressure beneath the words, an attempt to make him agree quickly without thinking. The polite tone could not hide the insistence in their posture and in their eyes. He paused, choosing his words carefully. He thanked them for the offer, but explained that he needed time to consider it. He asked questions about how they had come up with the figure, what legal arrangements had been made, and if the property had ever been formally part of the HOA's control. The men fumbled slightly, giving vague answers that did not fully satisfy him. It was clear that they were used to people agreeing without question, and his hesitation made them slightly uncomfortable. After they left, he felt a mix of excitement and unease. On one hand, the offer was tempting, a quick way to gain a substantial amount of money. On the other hand, the way it was presented, with underlying pressure and assumptions, raised red flags. He realized that ownership was not just about property. It was about control and respect. He wanted neither to be rushed nor intimidated. This was his land, his lake. And he intended to understand exactly what he owned before making any decisions. Over the next few days, he began to research. He spent hours reading legal documents, old property surveys, and community records. The more he looked, the more he understood that the HOA had never held legal claim over the lake. The paths, the dock, and the small cabin near the water were there, but none of them gave the HOA ownership. They had treated it as a communal space, assuming access without permission, but legally. The lake and surrounding land belonged to him. This realization gave him confidence, but also sharpened his awareness that misunderstandings or assumptions could lead to serious disputes. He also took time to observe the patterns of use. A few families still visited the lake, sometimes leaving behind litter or signs of casual camping. It was clear that the lake had been part of their routines for a long time, and now a new reality was emerging. The idea of limiting access or asserting his rights was not just a legal matter. It would also affect neighbors and the community he had started to see around him. He realized that any step he took would need to balance fairness with firmness. Then came a letter, formal and crisp, delivered to his mailbox. It was from the HOA, outlining the $500,000 offer in writing and suggesting a timeline for completion. There were references to community benefits, previous use, and shared traditions, all framed to make the sale appear reasonable and even expected. Reading it carefully, he saw that the letter was more than a proposal. It was an attempt to create a sense of obligation. He understood that the HOA believed that the lake belonged in practice, if not in law, to them. They wanted to turn assumptions into reality through pressure. He knew he had to act strategically. He did not respond immediately, choosing instead to document everything. Photographs of the property, notes on the condition of fences, signs of use, and even the small cabin were organized carefully. Each detail was noted because he understood that if disputes arose, having clear records would be critical. This was no longer just about enjoying the inheritance. It was about protecting it and ensuring that his rights as the owner were respected. Despite the tension, he tried to maintain balance. Mornings were still for walking the shore, afternoons for reviewing documents, and evenings for quiet reflection. Sitting by the lake, he could hear the distant chatter of children from neighboring houses and the occasional splash of fishing lines. It reminded him that the property existed in a larger community and that human interactions would always play a part. He resolved to remain calm, to think through actions carefully, and to avoid any hasty decisions. Then, one morning, he discovered footprints near the dock that were fresh. Someone had been on the lake during the night. He felt a surge of concern. While legal ownership gave him rights, enforcing them required action. Trespassing was a reality he had to face. He knew he needed to establish clear boundaries without causing unnecessary conflict. It was time to consider practical steps, signs, perhaps direct communication with anyone who had assumed access. He started small. A simple gate was installed at the main access point, with a clear sign stating that the lake was private property. He did not block every path yet, not wanting to provoke confrontation. But he wanted to make it clear that ownership was recognized and that trespassing would not be overlooked. It was a delicate balance between asserting rights and maintaining community relations. He hoped that setting boundaries early would prevent misunderstandings from growing into disputes. As days passed, HOA representatives returned, curious and slightly frustrated. They asked why the gate was installed and questioned the legality of restricting access. He responded calmly, explaining that ownership carried responsibilities and rights, and that it was important for him to ensure the property was protected. His tone was polite but firm, signaling that, while he was reasonable, he would not be pushed aside. The visitors left, perhaps not pleased, but at least aware that the situation had changed. He realized that asserting ownership was not a single action, but a series of steps, each one reinforcing the reality that the lake now belonged to him. Through it all, he kept a journal of events, noting each encounter, letter, and observation. Writing helped him process emotions and plan next steps. He reflected on the nature of inheritance, realizing that receiving something valuable was only part of the story. Protecting it, understanding its place in a community, and acting with wisdom were equally important. The lake was more than a body of water. It was a symbol of responsibility, autonomy, and the need to navigate challenges with thoughtfulness. One afternoon, as he sat by the water, he noticed a family approaching the edge of the property from a nearby path. They looked surprised to see the gate, and their expressions quickly shifted from casual curiosity to confusion. He approached them, introducing himself politely and explaining that the lake was now private property. He invited them to discuss access in a respectful manner if they had concerns, but made it clear that random visits were no longer allowed. The family nodded, a mixture of apology and understanding on their faces, and left without argument. It was a small victory, a reminder that communication, clarity, and calm assertiveness often achieved more than confrontation. He spent that evening thinking about the $500,000 offer. It remained tempting, but he had come to understand that the lake held a value far beyond money. It was a connection to nature, a symbol of independence, and a test of his ability to manage a complex situation. Selling it would solve immediate financial questions, but would also mean giving up control over something he had grown to care for deeply. He knew that any decision had to be made with both head and heart. Balancing practical needs with personal values, the week closed with a quiet moment of reflection. The lake shimmered in the late afternoon sun, the trees cast gentle shadows, and a soft breeze stirred the water. He felt a sense of pride and determination. He had navigated the first wave of pressure, established boundaries, and begun to assert his rights with clarity and calm. Yet he knew this was only the beginning. More challenges lay ahead, more negotiations, more tests of patience and wisdom. For now, though, he allowed himself to simply enjoy the beauty of the lake, the satisfaction of standing firm, and the anticipation of a journey that was only just beginning. The calm he had felt near the lake was slowly beginning to change. After installing the gate and asserting his ownership, he realized that the situation was moving beyond polite conversations and gentle reminders. The HOA had not expected anyone to take firm action, and their next steps were more forceful than he had anticipated. One morning, he found several notices pinned to the gate, official-looking and stamped with authority. They claimed that his actions were disrupting community access, and implied that fines could be applied if the gate was not removed. He read each notice carefully, noting the dates, signatures, and legal references. It was clear that they were trying to create pressure through bureaucratic means. He knew that reacting emotionally would not help. The first step was to gather all the documents he had accumulated: the property deeds, surveys, photographs, and notes from previous encounters. Each piece of evidence was cataloged and stored safely, so he would have a clear record of events if disputes escalated further. This process gave him a sense of control, reminding him that ownership was backed not just by personal belief, but by law and documentation. He also began keeping a log of interactions, including phone calls, letters, and unexpected visits. Understanding that organized records would be invaluable if legal action became necessary, the tension in the neighborhood became noticeable. Neighbors began to ask questions, some quietly curious, and others openly opinionated. He maintained politeness but firmness, explaining that the property had recently changed ownership and that he was working to ensure that boundaries were clear. Some seemed understanding, nodding in agreement, while others were less patient, hinting at frustration or disbelief. He realized that asserting control over the lake was about more than signs and fences. It was about communication, perception, and creating a precedent that could not easily be ignored. A week later, there was another escalation. Early in the morning, he noticed fresh tire tracks and footprints near the gate, evidence that someone had tried to bypass it. The gate itself was intact, but the message was clear. Not everyone accepted his authority. This incident was a turning point, confirming that legal ownership alone might not be sufficient to prevent intrusion. It was time to take stronger steps, both physical and procedural, to protect his property. He began researching local regulations on private land and trespassing, learning what legal measures he could enforce to protect the lake and its surroundings. While he was researching, he also reached out to a local attorney with experience in property disputes. The attorney reviewed the deeds, surveys, and HOA communications, offering guidance on how to handle trespassing, pressure tactics, and potential lawsuits. With professional advice, he felt more confident. He realized that dealing with the HOA would require strategy, patience, and careful documentation, not anger or impulsive reactions. His focus was on creating a firm foundation that would allow him to assert his rights without escalating conflict unnecessarily. Despite the growing tension, he continued to spend time by the lake. Each visit reinforced why he had chosen to maintain ownership rather than sell. The early mornings were especially peaceful, with mist rising from the water and birdsong filling the air. Sitting quietly, he reflected on the responsibilities that came with ownership. Protecting the lake was no longer just a personal decision. It was a matter of ensuring that the property was respected, maintained, and enjoyed under his terms. The beauty of the lake and the sense of autonomy it provided reminded him that some challenges were worth facing. Over the next several days, he began to make additional improvements. He reinforced the gate with a sturdier lock and added more signage, clearly stating that the property was private and that unauthorized entry would be considered trespassing. He repaired the fence along one side of the property where damage had occurred, making it more difficult for anyone to bypass. Each action was taken thoughtfully, balancing firmness with a desire to avoid unnecessary confrontation. He was determined to make the boundaries clear, both physically and legally, so that there would be no confusion about ownership. One afternoon, as he was inspecting the dock area, a group of HOA members appeared from the nearby path. Their expressions were serious, and they immediately began questioning his actions. He listened carefully, allowing them to speak without interruption, then calmly explained the legal basis for his ownership and the steps he had taken to protect the property. He emphasized that he had no intention of creating conflict, but that he would not allow unauthorized access to the lake. The conversation was tense but civil, and when they left, it was clear that they understood his position. Even if they were not pleased, he knew that this was only the beginning. The HOA had resources, influence, and experience in dealing with property matters, and he had limited knowledge compared to their network. Still, he relied on careful planning, documentation, and legal guidance to navigate each challenge. He realized that ownership was as much about foresight and strategy as it was about rights and responsibilities. Each day, he strengthened his understanding of the property, the community, and the potential obstacles ahead. Nighttime offered moments of reflection. Sitting by the lake under a sky full of stars, he allowed himself to appreciate the unique opportunity he had inherited. The lake was more than land or water. It was a personal sanctuary, a place where he could find clarity and strength. At the same time, he understood that vigilance was necessary. Ownership required action, and he was ready to take the steps needed to protect the property and assert his rights. Over the following week, more incidents occurred. Letters from the HOA continued to arrive, some polite, others increasingly insistent. Footprints and signs of use appeared near the water, signaling that some individuals were testing boundaries. Each occurrence was carefully recorded, photographed, and analyzed. He responded calmly, using clear communication, legal references, and professional guidance to ensure that his actions were justified and defensible. He was learning that patience, documentation, and strategic response were powerful tools in asserting control. During this time, he also reached out to a few neighbors who had been friendly. Explaining the situation and the importance of respecting private property, some offered support, understanding that the lake's status had changed while others remained neutral. These interactions were crucial, reinforcing that community perception mattered as much as legal ownership. By maintaining transparency and fairness, he strengthened his position, building quiet alliances that could prove valuable if disputes escalated further. Despite the challenges, he found moments of joy. Early mornings brought the soft mist rising from the lake, afternoons offered quiet reflection, and evenings provided the comfort of watching the sun set over the water. These experiences reminded him why he had chosen to maintain ownership. The lake was a place of peace, a symbol of independence, and a reward for careful action. Even as tensions with the HOA grew, these moments reinforced his commitment to protecting the property and the lifestyle it afforded. Then came a pivotal incident. One morning, he discovered that someone had attempted to tamper with the gate, leaving tools and marks on the lock. It was an unmistakable message. Not everyone accepted the new reality of ownership. He immediately documented the damage, took photographs, and contacted his attorney. Legal guidance suggested sending a formal notice to the HOA, making it clear that any further interference would be treated as trespassing and could lead to legal action. He followed this advice carefully, drafting a letter that was professional, firm, and unambiguous. The goal was to assert authority without provoking unnecessary conflict. As the days passed, the atmosphere shifted subtly. The combination of legal documentation, professional advice, and assertive action seemed to make an impression. While some continued to test boundaries, the frequency of incidents decreased. It became clear that consistent, calm, and legally grounded responses were effective. He began to feel more in control, recognizing that ownership was not only about the property itself, but about how one managed challenges and maintained credibility. Through all of this, he continued to enjoy the lake. He took long walks along the shore, observed wildlife, and maintained the property with care. Each act of stewardship reinforced his connection to the land and strengthened his position as the rightful owner. He realized that ownership was a combination of legal rights, personal responsibility, and consistent action. By balancing these elements, he was gradually establishing authority and earning respect. By the end of the third part of this journey, he had learned valuable lessons. Ownership required patience, clarity, and strategic action. Challenges would arise, but careful planning, professional guidance, and clear communication could overcome them. The lake remained a sanctuary, a place of beauty, and a symbol of his ability to navigate complex situations. As he sat by the water, watching the sun cast golden reflections on the surface, he felt a sense of accomplishment and readiness. The path ahead might be difficult, but he was no longer uncertain or passive. He was prepared to take whatever steps were necessary to protect his inheritance and ensure that the lake remained under his control. The tension in the neighborhood was growing, and he could feel it with every visit to the lake. The HOA had clearly decided to escalate their approach. Letters had increased in number, some arriving in the mail, others pinned to the gate or slipped under the cabin door. The letters used strong language, citing community guidelines, fines, and legal consequences, as if the lake belonged to them by right of habit. He read each letter carefully, noting dates, claims, and signatures. The content was often contradictory and confusing, but he understood that their strategy was clear: to overwhelm him, intimidate him, and push him towards selling the property. He could feel the pressure mounting, but he also felt a growing sense of determination. He started his day as usual, walking along the edge of the lake, breathing in the morning air. The birds were quiet, as if the tension had seeped even into the natural rhythm of the property. He reminded himself that calm and careful action were the keys to maintaining control. Emotional reactions would only play into the HOA's hands. Ownership was not just about having a deed. It was about defending it intelligently and consistently. With that mindset, he began planning his response piece by piece. First, he organized all the documentation he had accumulated over the past weeks. Deeds, surveys, photographs, letters, and personal notes were all reviewed and carefully cataloged. Each piece of evidence was filed both physically and digitally, ensuring he had quick access to it when needed. The meticulous process was not just about preparation. It was a mental exercise that strengthened his resolve. He felt empowered, knowing that he had proof of ownership, clear boundaries, and records of every interaction. This was his foundation, and he would build his defense upon it. He also arranged another meeting with his attorney to review the latest letters and communications. From the HOA, the attorney pointed out that many of the fines and threats were legally unenforceable, and that the HOA had overstepped its authority. It was reassuring to have confirmation that his actions were supported by the law. The attorney suggested sending a formal response to the HOA, outlining his ownership, documenting the overreach, and clearly stating that any further attempts to claim the property or enforce fines would be considered harassment. He carefully reviewed the draft, making minor adjustments, and then sent it. The letter was firm, professional, and unambiguous. It marked a turning point, signaling that he would no longer passively endure pressure. Despite the administrative focus, he made time for the lake. Each visit reminded him why he had chosen to protect this property rather than sell it. Early mornings were filled with mist rising off the water, sunlight reflecting on gentle ripples, and the distant calls of birds. He walked along the shoreline, noting the delicate balance of plants, rocks, and wildlife. Maintaining the land was not just a duty. It was a form of connection, a way to invest in something that gave him peace and purpose. He realized that protecting the lake was not just a legal matter, it was a commitment to preserving a space that he had grown to love. As the days passed, the HOA escalated further. Representatives came to the property asking to speak with him in person. Their tone had changed from polite inquiry to insistence, almost bordering on intimidation. He listened calmly as they spoke, allowing them to present their arguments, then responded with legal clarity. He explained his ownership, cited the deeds, and made it clear that the property was private. His calm demeanor seemed to unsettle them, as if they had expected resistance or confusion. By maintaining composure, he turned what could have been a confrontational exchange into a demonstration of authority and knowledge. One evening, he discovered fresh footprints near the dock and tire tracks leading through the property. Someone had been testing the boundaries again. The sight sparked a mix of frustration and determination. He took photographs, documented the evidence, and immediately contacted his attorney for guidance. The advice was clear. Continue to assert ownership firmly, document everything, and avoid direct confrontation if possible. Legal channels would support him more effectively than any physical confrontation. He made a plan to enhance security, install cameras, and reinforce the boundaries in visible ways, ensuring that any intrusion would be recorded and indisputable. The community's reaction was varied. Some neighbors observed quietly, acknowledging his efforts without comment. Others approached him to express concern or offer support. He realized that standing firm had consequences not only for himself, but also for the social fabric around the lake. By acting responsibly, he demonstrated that boundaries were to be respected, which in turn encouraged others to follow the rules. He understood that ownership was not only a personal responsibility, but also a public statement, signaling that respect for property and law was paramount. During this period, he reflected on the significance of inheritance. Receiving property was one thing, but defending it, managing it, and maintaining its value was another. He had inherited a lake, yes, but also a responsibility. It was a test of patience, judgment, and resilience. Each challenge he faced taught him more about strategy, human behavior, and the importance of remaining calm under pressure. He recognized that ownership was an ongoing process, not a static state, and that vigilance and careful planning were essential. He also began preparing for the possibility of formal legal action. While he preferred to resolve matters without court involvement, he understood that the HOA might continue to escalate. Together with his attorney, he outlined potential steps, scenarios, and responses. This proactive approach gave him confidence and clarity. Reducing anxiety and reinforcing his commitment to protecting the lake, he was no longer simply reacting. He was anticipating, preparing, and acting strategically. One morning, he noticed a small gathering of people near the property line. They seemed uncertain and hesitant. He approached calmly, introduced himself, and explained that the property was private and that access required permission. The group listened attentively and left without incident. This encounter reinforced a key lesson: clear communication. Firm boundaries and respectful behavior could prevent conflicts and establish authority. By consistently demonstrating control and fairness, he was gradually shifting the neighborhood's perception of the lake. Throughout this period, he maintained a balance between vigilance and enjoyment. Mornings were for reflection and observation, afternoons for documentation and communication, and evenings for quiet appreciation of the lake's beauty. Each day reinforced the value of the inheritance and the necessity of action. He understood that standing firm required both practical measures and emotional discipline, and he was committed to both. Then came the day when he received an official notice that the HOA intended to pursue legal measures to enforce their claimed fines. The letter was threatening, suggesting that they would involve local authorities and potentially seek court intervention. He reviewed the notice carefully, consulting his attorney and preparing a comprehensive response. The strategy was clear: counter every claim with facts, evidence, and legal precedent, ensuring that any attempt to overreach would be fully documented and challenged. It was a serious escalation, but he felt ready. The following weeks were a test of endurance. Letters, visits, and inquiries continued, but he remained steady. Each action he took was deliberate, measured, and informed by legal guidance. The HOA's influence began to waver as they realized that their attempts to intimidate or pressure him were ineffective. He maintained his routine by the lake, continuing to observe, reflect, and document. The beauty of the property provided solace and motivation, reminding him why he had chosen to defend it rather than sell. Neighbors began to notice the consistency and professionalism with which he managed the property. Some expressed quiet admiration, while others began to adjust their behavior, recognizing the firmness of the boundaries. The combination of legal clarity, personal presence, and careful communication was proving effective. Ownership was no longer a matter of assumption or casual access. It was a recognized and respected fact. By the end of this period, he felt a growing sense of accomplishment and empowerment. The HOA had escalated, attempted to apply pressure, and even threatened legal action. Yet he had remained calm, strategic, and unwavering. The lake remained his, protected and respected. Each challenge had strengthened his understanding of property management, legal rights, and human behavior. He knew that future conflicts could arise, but he had laid a foundation of authority, clarity, and preparedness that could withstand further tests. Sitting by the water one evening, he allowed himself to reflect. The lake was serene, the trees cast long shadows, and the sky was painted with the warm colors of sunset. He thought about the journey so far, from the unexpected inheritance to the careful assertion of ownership, and realized that he had learned far more than he had anticipated. Ownership was not just about land or water. It was about responsibility, strategy, and the courage to stand firm. The HOA's overreach had been a challenge, but it had also been an opportunity to demonstrate clarity, fairness, and determination. The lake was his. He was ready for whatever came next. The final phase of this journey began with a quiet sense of anticipation. After weeks of careful action, legal preparation, steadfast presence at the lake, he knew that the resolution of the conflict with the HOA was within reach. He had documented everything, followed legal advice meticulously, and maintained boundaries with calm authority. The lake, once threatened by assumptions and pressure, now stood as a symbol of his patience, determination. In strategic action, it started with one more letter from the HOA, but this time it was noticeably different. The tone was less aggressive, less insistent. They referenced previous communications, acknowledged his ownership, and proposed discussions to avoid formal legal battles. It was a subtle shift, signaling that the relentless documentation, calm, firmness, and legal clarity had begun to influence their approach. He read the letter carefully, noting the cautious language, and prepared a thoughtful response. His reply was professional yet firm, reaffirming ownership, outlining previous overreach, and emphasizing the importance of respecting private property. It was clear that he was no longer in a position of passive response, but had become the one setting the terms as days passed. the HOA representatives made one last attempt to visit the property. Hoping perhaps to negotiate or intimidate in person, he welcomed the interaction but maintained a composed presence, armed with his knowledge, documentation, and understanding of the law. He listened as they tried to present arguments, but he responded with calm clarity, citing evidence and legal points. There was no need for confrontation. The facts spoke for themselves. The representatives eventually left, visibly aware that their attempts to influence or pressure him had failed. He realized in that moment how far he had come from uncertain heir to confident, capable owner standing firm against overreach. The community began to shift as well. Neighbors who had been quietly observing saw the lake's ownership was clearly established and that trespassing or casual assumptions of access would no longer be tolerated. Respect grew, both for the property and for the owner who had handled a tense situation with patience and fairness. Even those who had questioned his actions began to acknowledge the careful balance of firmness and respect he had maintained. His presence by the lake, combined with thoughtful communication, had transformed the way the neighborhood viewed the property. Meanwhile, he continued to improve and maintain the land. The fences were repaired and reinforced, pathways were kept clear, and the area around the lake was clean and inviting. Small enhancements, like planting native flowers and creating safe spots for wildlife, reinforced his role as a responsible steward. Each action was both practical and symbolic, demonstrating his commitment to the property and his intention to care for it long term. He began to realize that ownership was not just about control. It was about nurturing, protecting, and enhancing something valuable for himself and the environment. The legal matters slowly drew to a close. With the HOA's recognition of his rights, their overreach became a matter of formal record rather than ongoing conflict. Any fines or claims they had tried to enforce were nullified, and the HOA was required to acknowledge the boundaries and limitations of their authority. This outcome was not just a victory in terms of property rights, but also a reaffirmation that careful preparation, strategic action, and calm persistence could overcome intimidation and pressure. He had learned that knowledge, documentation, patience were far more powerful than anger or impulsive reaction. He spent the following weeks consolidating his position. He reviewed every document, ensured that all boundaries were clearly marked, and confirmed that communication with neighbors and the HOA was documented. It was meticulous work, but it brought peace of mind. The lake was secure, respected, and his ownership was uncontested. Beyond the legal and practical aspects, he felt a deep emotional satisfaction, a sense of justice, accomplishment, and fulfillment that could not be measured in monetary terms. With the immediate conflict behind him, he turned more attention to the joys of having the lake. Early mornings were his favorite, with mist hovering over the water and sunlight streaming through the trees. He would walk slowly along the shore, listening to birds and watching the water reflect the sky. Fishing, kayaking, or simply sitting by the lake became ways to reconnect with the peace that had initially drawn him to the property. Each activity was enhanced by the knowledge that he had fought for the right to enjoy this land fully and without interference. He also found himself reflecting on the lessons learned through this process. Ownership was more than a title. It was responsibility, vigilance, and ethical action. Challenges would arise in life, often from unexpected sources, and the way he had navigated the HOA conflict had shown him that preparation. Patience and calm decision-making were crucial. He understood that respect could not be demanded through force alone. It had to be earned through consistent action and fair treatment. His relationship with the lake had become a microcosm for these principles, showing that values and strategy often go hand in hand. The neighbors gradually adapted to the new reality. The lake was respected as private property, and casual trespassing ceased. Some neighbors even offered support or assistance, recognizing that his actions had restored order and clarity. Small gestures, like neighbors keeping the paths clear or helping maintain the area, reinforced that standing firm with fairness could build trust and positive relationships. He realized that conflict, when handled correctly, could strengthen both authority and community ties. One weekend, he invited a few close neighbors for a casual walk along the lake. The atmosphere was relaxed, friendly, and appreciative. He shared the story of the property, the inheritance, and the steps taken to secure it. Listening to their reactions, he noticed a mix of admiration and respect. They understood that ownership came with responsibility, that asserting rights did not mean being aggressive, and that calm determination could lead to successful resolution. The gathering reinforced that while the conflict had been challenging, it had also fostered understanding and strengthened relationships. In the months that followed, he continued to maintain and enjoy the lake. He spent mornings observing wildlife, afternoons improving paths in the dock, and evenings reflecting on sunsets over the water. The lake had become a personal sanctuary, a place of peace, accomplishment, and contemplation. Every ripple on the surface, every bird call, every reflection of sunlight was a reminder of the journey he had taken from inheritance to confrontation, finally to victory. The challenges he had faced had shaped his approach to ownership, community, and personal growth. He occasionally revisited the letters, notes, and photographs that had documented the conflict. Looking back, he marveled at the transformation. The threats, fines, and pressure tactics from the HOA now seemed distant and almost surreal. What had once felt overwhelming was now a testament to resilience, preparation, and clarity of purpose. He realized that this experience had not only secured the lake, but it also strengthened his confidence, problem-solving skills, and understanding of human dynamics. The HOA, having acknowledged the limits of their authority, moved on. Any lingering tension faded, replaced by a mutual, if cautious, understanding. He no longer received letters or visits, and the property returned to a state of peaceful enjoyment. The lake, once a source of potential conflict, had become a stable, beautiful, and secure place. Ownership was fully established, respected, protected. He spent a quiet evening by the lake, reflecting on the journey as the sun dipped below the horizon. The water shimmered with the last light of day, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. He thought about how far he had come from receiving an unexpected inheritance to navigating pressure, asserting rights, and finally achieving a resolution that balanced legality, fairness, and personal satisfaction. The lake was no longer just a property. It was a symbol of perseverance, responsibility, and victory. As night fell, he felt a deep sense of peace. The conflict with the HOA had ended, the lake was secure, and his connection to the land had deepened. He realized that the inheritance had been more than a gift. It had been an opportunity to learn, grow, and demonstrate that calm, strategic action could overcome challenges. Sitting by the water, he made a silent promise to continue caring for the lake, maintaining its beauty and respecting its place in the community. It was not just a victory over the HOA, but a personal triumph that reaffirmed his values, resilience, and ability to protect what mattered most.